So before I, start actually pouring into the lecture, and we're going to breeze through a lot of the stuff in the beginning, then we're going to talk about more of the important applications later on. Do you guys have any questions about anything that we've effectively covered so far in the class that you'd like me to kind of go a little bit more in depth on?
How are these quiz going? Like, are they going just like by like chapter 1, chapter 2? Like,
it's going to seem very similar to XPhys, where it's effectively, it's going to be a little bit of the new material and then always some review material. So they're always going to be cumulative. So good, Hannah?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about good old energy production. So turns out we need to produce energy because we use a lot of it, specifically when myosin is contracting on actin and then also pumping that calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum that allows us to relax. Now we're going to create it through the different energy systems we talked about in XPhys, we talked about in XPhys. We're going to store it effectively as glycogen or as triglyceride storage, and that's both inside the muscle when it comes to fat, but then also in our adipose tissue. And then the many different ways that we're going to regulate it, and all the regulation is going to come back to negative feedback. So you guys should remember the happy little differences we're going to have between our fiber types. Our slow fiber types are much better aerobically speaking, specifically when it comes to using fats as a fuel, along with the, okay, Lane, I see your point in the chat. No worries, if you have questions, just throw it up in the chat. And they're going to not be as good at ATP PCR, and they're going to be actually a little bit slower with carbohydrate metabolism, specifically just talking about glycolysis, whereas obviously the mitochondrial function, so citric acid cycle, and otherwise going to be way better. So when you're looking at the enzymes, citrate synthase and SDH are both involved in the citric acid cycle. PFK, phosphofructokinase, is the third enzyme in glycolysis. Phosphorylase activity, that's going to be literally just breaking down ATP and otherwise. Myoglobin is the protein that's going to allow us to get oxygen into the mitochondria, shipping it effectively from the blood. And then the rest of this should be relatively straightforward for you guys. Now, this is just the basic run through of how each of those different macronutrients is going to be metabolized and the energy systems they're going into. This should effectively be review. If it's not, spend some quality time reviewing it and make sure that you understand how we're going to be able to convert from one to another. Now be mindful when we're looking at the fats plus glycerol, because triglycerides is literally 3 fatty acids bound to 1 glycerol. The glycerol is the part that can go into glycolysis. Fatty acids can only go through inhibit oxidation. So when it comes to carbohydrate metabolism, we're going to have good old anaerobic metabolism, which is going to be a solid way to produce a little bit of energy, but nowhere near as much as whenever we break it down aerobically. So just a quick little reminder on the right. Yeah, we're going to net 2 ATP from glycolysis, because remember we have the 2 for the activation cost. Unless we come from glycogen, then it's only 1. So we're only net 2, maybe 3 ATP. It's then when we have all the NADH that we generate from glycolysis and the citric acid cycle that we're going to get the major energy production if we break down carbohydrates aerobically, which is going to be in the tune of 36 to 38 ATP, depending on where we start from. So this is our happy little glycolysis, which has 3 phases: our activation, cleavage, and then substrate level phosphorylation. And you do not need to memorize any of it, but instead what I want you guys to make sure you understand is hexokinase is that first reaction. That's where we're going to effectively keep a glucose molecule inside of our cells. Now in the muscle, it's known as glucokinase, and it's going to be active at 1/4 of the same concentration of glucose, which is useful, which means literally when we're eating carbs, the first thing that we're going to go ahead and top off is actually going to be our intramuscular glycogen levels. Then we're going to start topping off our glycogen levels in our liver. So once we phosphorylate it, it can't leave, which is a good thing because we don't want glucose just going out of the cell if we want to use it otherwise. From there, we can go synthesize into glycogen, or obviously we can break it down completely and use it for energy. Now, PFK, phosphofructokinase, is the major rate limiting step. This is going to be the one where we've got a lot of different negative feedback mechanisms to keep this from moving forward. And then whether or not we have oxygen available, we are going to be converting pyruvate into acetyl-CoA if we're going to go through the citric acid cycle, or we're going to be converting it into lactate via lactate dehydrogenase. So when it comes to breaking down fat, this is what's known as lipolysis. We are going to take it up in the muscle both in the form of LDL, LDL particles, along with we are going to be taking them up as individual fatty acids. And they're typically going to be bound to albumin when they're in the bloodstream. And we are going to be able to hormonally get us to break down more carbohydrate from pretty much all of our stress hormones, along with growth hormone. However, insulin actually is going to shut down fat metabolism. This is part of the arguments people have for doing a low-carb diet as a ways to help with fat loss, when in reality, it's more about the caloric balance, guys. That's what's always going to come back to. So if we're in that deficit, yes, we're still producing insulin, but because we're not taking as many calories, we're not using, or we're not having to produce as much insulin, so we're not going to be grunting fat being broken down from our adipocytes and then put into the body. Now, obviously, if we're not going to use that those fatty acids and the glycerol for energy, it's going to go through what's known as reesterification, where effectively we are going to be turning it back into fat. And notice that lactate is going to help with that signaling pathway. Now, when it comes to getting the fats into the muscles, we're going to be using what's known as the CAT1 and CAT2 transporter that's going to get it from the sarcoplasm into the mitochondria. And notice, guys, carnitine, so you've maybe seen that on labels for energy drinks and otherwise, is what is going to effectively bind to the acetyl-CoA, so it's the end of one part of the fatty acid, and bring it into the cell, so now it can go ahead and go through beta oxidation. This is one of the major rate-limiting steps when we're talking about fat metabolism and breaking it down. So, another happy flow chart, but now you guys have the wonderful delineation between, is it occurring in the cytosol or the mitochondria? In that, remember, beta oxidation, citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain all occur inside of the mitochondria. Glycolysis and a little bit of deamination is going to occur inside of the cytosol. Deamination is removing the nitrogen from amino acids. And then we have our happy citric acid cycle. Don't worry about memorizing this either. Instead, what we're really focusing on is how we're going to keep cycling through that acetyl-CoA, which is going to generate us more and more NADH, FADH2, along with GTP, which will be immediately converted into ATP, and this is where we're actually giving off carbon dioxide. It's going to be, once we get to the electron transport chain, that thanks to all of those NADH that we've produced in the FADH2, they're going to pump protons, aka hydrogens, into the inner membrane space, which is going to create an electrical chemical gradient, whereas those protons are coming back out, the hydrogens, it is going to be what synthesizes ATP as the final electron acceptor is going to be oxygen when it comes to energy production that's going to occur thanks to the electron transport chain. So literally the electron transport chain is going to effectively give you the final product of turning oxygen into water and a whole lot of ATP. So, well, what do we know? It turns out you can synthesize a lot of ATP relatively quickly, and then it's going to go down real fast when we're talking about that ATP PCR system. So this is why we have done, or will do in some folks' cases, the wonderful Wingate lab. So you get an idea of, yes, it turns out your performance is going to go down pretty quickly. Now, in the meantime, we're going to be able to ramp up different pathways. So example, when we're looking on the right, you're going to see a little bit more of the energy production. So the initial is going to be the ATP, and then you can be looking at the phosphocreatine where you're going to get more energy production. But notice, guys, our axes, our energy production is going to be far, far faster with the resynthesis rate initially compared to a little bit later, and that's, sorry, anaerobic glycolysis on the right, ATP PCR on the left. Now, we're going to use every source of energy that we have available to us. The key is the intensity of exercise is going to influence which fuel we're using preferentially. So right now, you guys sitting there, hanging out at home, you're going to be burning mostly fat. So we're utilizing the fatty acids we have stored inside of our muscles. We're going to be utilizing the fatty acids that happen to be stored inside of our fat cells. We're going to be pulling in some of those free fatty acids, obviously, from our bloodstream, because that's how it gets transported from one to the other. Now, as we increase exercise intensity, we're going to utilize glucose more as a fuel. And so if we're using enough glucose that our blood sugar is going down because we're pulling it into the muscles, along with using the muscle glycogen, our liver is going to release its glycogen stores so it can try to regulate our blood sugar. Because it turns out our brain likes to think good, so we want to make sure that we have a consistent supply of carbohydrate. Now, at the same time, if we're going super high intensity, we're going to be really running through that phosphocreatine stores pretty rapidly. And the other little monkey wrench to keep in here, guys, is remember, it's not just the muscle you're using, but the muscle fibers inside of that muscle that you're using that you're depleting the stores. So if you're exercising at a super low intensity, you're really only tapping into your type 1 fibers. As we increase that intensity, we're tapping into bigger and bigger fibers, which aren't as good aerobically. So that's why we're going to see more of that lactate accumulation in the blood and otherwise from it. You do use amino acids as a fuel source. It's used relatively sparingly. They're not going to be a major contributor to exercise performance. Now, when it comes to our metabolic responses to exercise, we're going to have two different causes of fatigue, which is one is the fatigue caused by high intensity exercise, which is going to be different than the fatigue caused from prolonged exercise. So who wants to go ahead and you can unmute yourself or throw it up in the chat of what is going to be the major cause of fatigue from high intensity exercise?
I'm going to speak up here. Would it be lactic? Wait. Never mind.
Would it be lactic weight?
No.
Lactic weight. I mean, lactic weight is, I'm kidding. Go ahead. Give it a shot, dude. If you're wrong, you're wrong. Who cares? Just try.
I was going to say like the built up of like lactic acid.
Who agrees with Jake?
Well, what about burning more fat oxidation? Or fat, yeah.
So now, both the running out of fat stores is, I mean, come on, guys, this is America. Have you ever seen an American run out of fat stores? No, I'm kidding. Now, Blaine in the chat put up running out of glycogen stores. That's a major cause of fatigue in prolonged exercise. So when we say prolonged, this could be running something like a 5K, 10K, half marathon, ultra marathon, full crazy. That's where you're going to potentially literally run out of glycogen stores. Your blood sugar is going to really fall through the floor, and you're going to have to switch over to fat as a fuel. And if you run out of fat as a fuel, you're effectively dead anyways. So that's not going to be something we're going to test too much in a lab because that's not ethical. Now, what Jake threw out there of lactate accumulation, absolutely that's a potential cause of fatigue from high intensity exercise, as is depletion of your ATP-CR energy stores. So think of it along these lines. High intensity exercise, we're talking about really heavy lifting. We're talking about maximal sprinting. We're talking about full efforts for as long as you can maintain them. So, for example, Zach was kind enough to come and lift weights with me today. And so he and I, we picked things up and we put them down. And if you were to watch us lifting weights, you would see that as we go through the set, our speed on the bar goes down and down and down. And that's not like, it'd be fun to spend more time with each repetition of this very heavy oppressive weight. What's happening instead is because of the load that we're using, we're tapping into all of our muscle fibers and we're rapidly depleting the ATP-PCR system. And then we're having to tap into the anaerobic glycolytic system. But a lot of our muscle fibers are not that good at it. So they fatigue out rapidly and your force production goes down. So the bar moves slower. Same thing if we were to have you guys all get on the track and we all sprint as hard as we can, you're going to hit that top speed in probably the first 4 to maybe 6 seconds if you're real slow off the line, but you're not going to keep that peak speed for more than another 5 seconds from there. And your speed's going to keep going down and down and down because we've exhausted the ATP-PCR system, specifically the phosphocreatine stores, and we're now having to use the anaerobic system. And when the pH drops low enough, thanks to all of the lactate and the proton that comes with it accumulation, literally your enzymes in your cells don't work like they're supposed to. So you literally can't produce any more energy. So you do bonk out. So Jake, good job, bud. You definitely had a solid part of the question. And Blaine and Zach, that's a good point for when it comes to prolonged exercise of where we're going to see a depletion of glycogen. So does that make sense to all of you guys?
Protein can be used at all, because I know that's always a last resort, but you know what I mean? I know it's like hardly ever used in
Well, protein
energy,
can definitely
but
be used.
yeah,
It's just used seldomly.
yeah, okay. I didn't know what situation you're talking about, like exactly for it.
Yeah, no worries, Nolan. Your immune system actually uses protein as a fuel source relatively frequently, specifically glutamine. But you're not really going to be using enough of that as an actual like source of energy for exercise that we really worry about it, unless you're talking about like some hardcore starvation situations. And even then, you're going to be using a lot of fats as fuel, ketone bodies, what little blood sugar you have, and then also, yeah, using some of your muscle body protein. The problem with using protein for an energy source, guys, it's the equivalent of, let's say, and thank you guys for putting that up in the poll. If we were to have, if you think of your body as like a car, if we were literally going to dismantle parts of the car while we're riding in it and using it as a fuel source. Yeah, it's a solution to a problem, but I'd rather just use the fuel in my gas tank and then just refill my gas tank. So, glycogen stores, you can optimize ATP-CR through training specificity, but can it be aided in diet as well? Okay, cool. Blaine's question is, can you optimize ATP-PCR through training specificity, but can it be aided in diet as well? Yeah, that's the entire point of supplementing creatine. It literally helps you increase your intramuscular creatine stores. And what I find very personally interesting about it is it also is going to increase your nervous system storage of creatine. You do store creatine inside of your brain. So there's some researchers, John Oliver, not the one from HBO, a very different and very jacked John Oliver, friend of mine. He's been doing some research on what you can do to help decrease risk of concussion. And his like top 2 supplements, and this is for MMA fighters, football players, etc., is omega-3 fatty acids, specifically EPA and DHA, and creatine monohydrate. So yes, you can definitely influence it through nutrition. And that's the big overarching points of why we're touching on all these things, because we can literally improve all these systems aside from training specificity, but also through the joys of nutritional decisions. So what we have here, guys, is just some effects of doing some long-term steady state exercise. Of notice, you're going to see that plasma glucose eventually going down. This is 2 hours of training. I don't think a lot of you guys are doing that much cardio. If you are, cool. If you're not, cool. It's your own personal choice. But notice that you're going to see initial dip and then an increase in plasma fatty acids, but notice a consistent decrease in muscle glycogen. So my question for you guys is, why do we not see an initial dip of the plasma glucose and it takes a while longer before we're going to start to see that decrease? Abby, why do you think that would be?
Does it have to do with oxygen and using just the muscles first before it taps into the blood?
The entire time that you're going to be training, you are going to be pulling carbohydrates, specifically glucose, out of your bloodstream. That's completely normal. However, as we're exercising, you're going to always be using those intramuscular stores. So instead, think of it of what tissue could be giving us and putting glucose into the blood. So effectively, it's depleting its own stores at the same time by adding it and keeping the blood stable until it essentially starts to run out, and then we see the blood stores go down. Yes, Blaine, absolutely. It's the liver glycogen stores. That's what we're going through. Because it turns out for these examples, you'd be doing blood draws so you can look at the values, along with muscle biopsies so you can see the changes in glycogen. And I don't think a lot of people really want to give up 5 different liver biopsies so they can go ahead and see those levels change too. Now, how hard we're exercising is also going to be related to how quickly we're going to deplete the carbohydrates. Yes, Jake?
I was gonna like the chart you showed us. How would that differ with an athlete that's diabetic?
Great question. So the big difference between an athlete that's diabetic compared to a typical athlete is the plasma glucose level is gonna be a lot more interesting. So it might dip down a lot faster, depending on a lot of things, like, literally how well is their diabetes managed. And that's not a personal judgment. That's more of just a straight up, some folks are really, really good about their blood sugars and maintaining them, but obviously the intensity of exercise that you're doing, if you weren't prepared for, you might be depleting your blood glucose levels far faster. Or if the exercise intensity wasn't as high, you might not be depleting yourself as fast. And then notice, guys, the muscle glycogen stores, if you see it really get eaten up and then decrease with time, well, if this athlete didn't start with a full muscle glycogen level, they're going to deplete their plasma glucose level even faster. And they should hopefully have enough liver glycogen otherwise that they can re-regulate. But man, like diabetes, there's a reason why, you need some solid medical supervision initially until you learn how your body reacts and you become more well-tuned with it for individuals that are diabetic. Like obviously it can be done. And there's also, pumps and a number of different things that people can effectively have, for lack of a better term, kind of mounted to them. So it's going to regulate it for them. But I mean, I played, whenever I was in high school, a guy that I played water polo with, he was a type 1 diabetic. And he would have to check his blood sugar multiple times throughout the game to make sure that he wasn't going to bonk. And he was a goalie, so it wasn't as metabolically stressful for him as it was for the rest of us. But at the same time, it's a metabolically taxing sport. So good question, Jake. And so, that lends ourselves to this point is, notice, guys, here, this is wet weight. So this is grams of glycogen per kilogram of muscle. And we can see it's starting at about 18. Well, this is depending on how well fed you are. So if you didn't top off your glycogen very well to start, you could be starting at like 10, 8, 6, 4, or nearly empty. And so if you try to do that intermittent 120% of your VO2 max, which sounds horrible for 15 minutes, you'd completely bonk out. You wouldn't even be able to make it that far. You would deplete your glycogen well beforehand. And then, depending on your exercise intensity, how well trained you are, how well fat adapted you are, that's going to move all of these lines around accordingly. Now, depending on our intensity of exercise, we are going to be taking up glucose at a higher rate. So if you're working at a higher intensity, you're going to go ahead and take in the carbohydrate faster. Notice the line ends at that 60%. Well, that's simply because you effectively hit fatigue. You weren't able to keep up the output anymore. And then same thing with the 30%. They could hold it for a pretty decent amount of time. You are going to be able to shift to using fats as fuel a little bit better as you go further through a long training bout. But even then, we're still talking about a finite fuel source. So when I want you guys to conceptualize how you're using these fuels, this is the key to effectual bar graphs to look at. And then we have the actual line graph so you can kind of see how we have that flow. So if we're looking at ATP resynthesis, so what different energy systems are we using, or what type of fuel sources are we using to resynthesize ATP? When we're exercising, and then notice the upper is for just a set duration, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 90, and 100. You can see how there is a shifting with time to try to rely less and less on muscle glycogen, relying on fat more and more, and then increasing and decreasing reliance upon glucose. Whereas we look at the bottom left, you can see how as we increase our exercise intensity, we're going to rely less on our plasma fatty acids and more on our muscle glycogen chiefly, along with a little bit more on our blood glucose and definitely a bit more on our fatty acids from inside of the muscles. So if you're looking at the velocity that someone's going to run, you can see how at those lower speeds, and this is for someone that's in pretty good shape, guys, just so we're clear, that at that lower percentage of VO2 max, they're going to be utilizing mostly fat as a fuel. So hence why they talk about the fat burning zone, which is always related to lower exercise intensities. As we shift our way into higher intensities, we're going to have a linear relationship of increased demand of blood glucose, but notice how we have that point of inflection and then that massive takeoff with using muscle glycogen as a fuel. And most folks, depending on how much carbohydrate they're storing in their muscle thanks to their diet and otherwise, usually you figure you're going to have 90 minutes to 2 hours of pretty moderate to high intensity exercise, specifically aerobic, that you can maintain worth of carbohydrate store before they're going to effectively redline and empty it. So this is that example, only now written out a little bit clearer for you guys, which is how much energy for each of these sources are we going to have. Now, when you guys look at the column, this is kcal, so this is going to be the one that's going to be the easiest for you guys to understand. Jai might understand the kilojoules a little bit more depending on nutritional labels in Australia, but I'm not that hopped up on that. But notice, guys, when you see that duration, okay? So literally, as far as using something preferentially as a fuel, and notice, guys, this is for a 70 kilogram European male, aka 154 pound person with 15% body fat. This person literally has, with a, you know, that's passable, like you're not super lean, but you're definitely in shape, has 93,000 calories worth of fat stores on them. Literally meaning if they're using 100 calories per mile, they could walk from here to Florida and they would be totally ripped by the time they got there if they were only using fat as a fuel. Meanwhile, if we were to try to run at a high enough intensity that we're really only using carbohydrates, notice, guys, we've got only about 100 minutes worth. So we're not even talking about a full 2 hours. And last time I checked, there's only one human being that's been able to do a marathon in less than 2 hours. And that's nobody currently on this message. Can glycogen have an effect in weight gain or loss? Yes. For every 1 gram of carbohydrate you store 2.4 grams of water with that glycogen. So that's why a lot of individuals, when they first start a diet, they lose a lot of weight the first week. And that's actually due to depletion of their muscle glycogen levels, which in turn is going to help with the weight loss, but that's just water weight. So hence why, you know, it's about, like we talked about last week, kind of having the even hand and consistently trying to get weight off of someone and not trying to do it too rapidly simply because it's near impossible for the body to maintain those rapid weight loss periods. So yeah, so you're right, Ian. Someone that does a ketogenic diet, they're going to lose a huge amount of weight the first week. And so actually this involves a interesting, now we're talking about the psychology. What, and you guys can unmute yourself or throw this up in chat, would be the advantage of, for someone trying to lose weight, doing something like a ketogenic diet for when they have that massive weight loss the first week, but it's only due to water weight? What's the advantage there?
Well, wouldn't the advantage be psychologically they think they're doing something right, so they're going to keep doing it because they're going to think they're going to keep getting the same results?
Awesome. Exactly. They get an immediate, quick validation of their work because they've lost a lot of weight. Problem is that's not going to be kept up with week 2. So because they've already lost the water weight, the first easy pounds, now that can also work psychologically against them because, well, it worked initially, but now it doesn't work anymore. So does that make sense how it can be a potentially useful mechanism, but that's where you have to know the psychology of the person you're working with and what's going to be the methodology that works well with them. Because when we're talking about losing weight, it's obviously, there's, you know, billions of dollars every single year that are spent on supplements that don't work and diets that are lackluster at best by people that want to change themselves in one way or shape or another. And it's not due to a lack of knowledge out there. It's a lack of adherence. And that adherence is caused for a myriad of reasons. Yes, Jake, I saw you unmuted yourself.
I didn't have anything.
Okay. So we have a lot of different ways that we are currently regulating our metabolism. We have intracellular factors like AMPK, which is a signaling pathway, specifically one of the proteins in it, that's all related to energy levels inside of a cell. mTOR is related to anabolism. We're going to talk about those later on in the class. Now, we then have a myriad of hormones. So insulin and glucagon, which should be relatively straightforward to you guys, with insulin bringing blood sugar down, glucagon bringing it up. Catecholamines, epinephrine, norepinephrine, the stress hormones, which can help us effectively mobilize these fuels. Growth hormone, which remember is going to help us break down fat, can make it so that we're not using as much carbohydrate as a fuel. So there's some insulin resistance for people that are abusing the drug, not for natural growth hormone production. And then we got cortisol, which is just really getting it so we can use everything as a fuel source, which is good to a certain extent. It's bad if we run it too much. And then we have IL-6, interleukin-6, which is another type of connoissoid signaling molecule, which is made by the muscles due to training, which is actually going to be slightly pro-inflammatory, so that we're going to get the signaling we need to in order to get that muscle recover from the immune system. And it's also going to help liberate some fuels. Now, as we train, we're going to see that we are metabolically going to be obviously adapting. So it's not just obviously the exercise you're doing, but it's the nutrition of what you're doing with it. So if you happen to be eating a lower carbohydrate diet and doing a lot of aerobic style work, you're going to see upregulations of things like beta oxidation, and obviously our ability to utilize fat as a fuel, increasing mitochondria number and otherwise. If you're just plowing through carbohydrates like your life depends on it, and you're doing a solid amount of aerobic work, you're going to see a lot more upregulation of the enzymes related to glycolysis, along with still having the changes in the mitochondria and increases in the enzymes for the citric acid cycle, specifically succinate dehydrogenase, SDH, and citrate synthase, CS. The burden of knowledge and things I remember, don't worry about writing down that last part, but do understand the fact that we're going to have specific adaptations. Now, if you do a whole lot of protein, that doesn't really seem to change as far as how we're going to metabolically adapt. But herein lies why we should care about this, which is what's our goal with our athlete? And specifically, what are we training them for? And so for a lot of people, it doesn't matter. We want them to use whatever fuel works for them. And we want to make sure that they're fueling themselves appropriately for the goals of performance or otherwise they're looking for. But let me posit a more interesting question for you. If you knew that you were about to go through some type of situation that you would have very, very limited access to food in general, which macronutrient would you effectively be trying to become better at using if you knew you were facing starvation? Why?
That's what your body has the most of. So you'll have like the longest storage of that one.
Exactly. That's where I can see the logic behind being adapted to the ketogenic diet. Because if you know, is say you are going to be somebody in the military going on maneuvers, you're going to be behind enemy lines, blah, blah, blah. You might have to go for days without food. If you happen to be an athlete that's running on really high carbohydrate intakes, you're going to have a hard go because you're not going to be very well metabolically acclimated to it. And part of the ketogenic diet is literally masking effectively starvation. So the joys, but human beings have a lot of metabolic flexibility, meaning we can adapt to nearly any type of nutrition, effectively diet, as long as we're getting those essential nutrients like we outlined last week. Key is, once again, what works for whoever you're working with. So now, this is just talking about the wonderful signaling and how each of these are going to be working. And specifically, guys, the ones you're probably not familiar with, once again, is IL-6. And notice the breaking down of glycogen, breaking down of fats, and it's going to also be telling our body to release more cortisol, which is the reason why when we do huge amounts of training, we're going to have huge amounts of cortisol release. And notice that cortisol is also helping cause protein breakdown. Now, just a quick little remember, cortisol happens to be a steroid hormone, which means it's going to be in the blood, and then it's going to bind to a receptor, which is going to directly influence our protein expression inside of the cells. Meanwhile, things like epinephrine, they are going to be an amino acid hormone, Insulin is going to be a peptide hormone, and those are going to use secondary messengers, which in turn are going to influence effectively different cascades that are going to occur inside of the cell thanks to their binding. Now, a really big thing to understand is the positive effects that nutrition, or specifically training, can have on your own natural insulin sensitivity. So, obviously, we utilize the hormone insulin. That's going to allow us to take up carbohydrate in the two types of cells that have sensitivity to insulin. Those are our fat cells and our muscle cells. So when we are going to have insulin signal, it's going to move what's known as the GLUT4. It's glucose transporter number 4. There's, I think there's like 9 or 10 different ones. That's one of them. And that's the one that specifically is going to be signaled for by insulin. And also notice exercise is going to cause those transporters to go to the cellular membrane of your muscle cell, which in turn is going to naturally increase your carbohydrate sensitivity without the use of insulin. And that's why exercise is going to help with control of specifically type 2 diabetes for a lot of individuals if they aren't physically active to start. And then it is still an important thing to maintain if you happen to have type 1 diabetes, because that's going to allow you to at least have a more consistent response to your insulin. Does that make sense to you guys? Great. So what we have here, guys, is some responses that are going to occur thanks to being on different levels of a carbohydrate diet, whether it's high or low. So you can see the blood sugar levels, you can see the stress hormone, epinephrine response, and the glucagon response. So individuals that happen to have the lower carbohydrate diet aren't going to be able to maintain as long of aerobic style exercise as someone that happens to be on a high carbohydrate diet, because they're going to have much better topped out glycogen. Now, this can also be achieved by just increasing your total calories, but that's why, notice guys, in the 60 minutes to 120 minute duration of a moderate to high intensity pace, this is really applicable to aerobic style athletes. That's not a lot of people. So if you're working with someone that wants to go do a marathon, a triathlon, anything along those lines, yes. Make sure that you're getting in enough carbohydrate. If they want to be a ketogenic athlete, that's fine, but I would definitely suggest supplementing with carbohydrates around their exercise. Meanwhile, if you're working with a person that just wants to be in better shape, it's not they need to be in a high or a low carbohydrate diet. The key is what's going to be the diet that happens to be the most feasible for them. That's going to keep them from, effectively gaining too much weight or not enough weight compared to what they're really wanting to accomplish. Now, what's also fascinating is hormone responses are also related to the training level. So people that are untrained are going to have a much greater stress response from our catecholamines to our growth hormone and our cortisol production. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, is literally what stimulates the adrenals to release cortisol. So notice individuals that happen to be untrained are going to be dumping a lot of hormones, and this is 210 watt cycle exercise, whereas the individuals that were already in pretty good shape, they have very, very little response to it. And so the key is your training stimulus, whatever they're habituated to, that effectively is going to slowly give a smaller hormonal response. If you happen to add a new stress or a much larger stress than you're used to, you're going to have a greater hormonal response than you've had before. And
wait, can you explain?
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Can you explain the ACTH again? What you were talking about with that? I just got a little lost on that.
No, man, you're good. Talking to myself in the room. I hate it. I like talking to you guys, but really don't. Let's be honest, we're all getting through this pandemic in our own way. Now, adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, is released from your pituitary gland. That is going to go into circulation and eventually signal on your kidneys. I'm pointing at them, but obviously the frame is not that large. And specifically your adrenal glands. That is going to tell your adrenal gland to release cortisol. So a lot of the hormone signaling pathways are effectively you go from A to B to C to D. So it's just kind of you ping pong through until you get the response that effectively the body needs to give for whatever endeavor we're looking for. So for other hormones, like there's luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, LH and FSH, which is going to be released from your pituitary gland, and then that is going to, this is why you should be very happy that it's not in the frame, it's going to signal on your testes or ovaries, whichever you happen to have, and that is going to signal for the production of your sex-related hormones. Now, you're also going to have TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, which can be released again from the pituitary gland, and that's going to go and signal for your thyroid gland to go ahead and produce more T4 and T3. So effectively, when it comes to the master gland concept that we talked about in exercise physiology, that's really what we're talking about. Just A goes to B, goes to C, and it has that physiological effect on the body.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, no, but it's no worries. So big key with this slide, guys, is notice all the different hormonal effects and intracellular energy level effects that are going to either turn the enzyme on, meaning positive, or inhibit it, meaning negative. So when it comes to breaking down muscle glycogen, notice, guys, if we've got high levels of ATP, we're not going to break down glycogen. If we have low or we have high amounts of AMP, a lot of phosphate and a lot of calcium and also epinephrine, we're going to start breaking down glycogen. And that's why when individuals get really stressed, they burn through their carbohydrate stores in their muscles faster and they actually bonk out faster. Same thing if they're exercising in really cold environments, which is kind of a fun and interesting little phenomenon. Now, meanwhile, when we look at breaking down the liver glycogen, well, glucagon, obviously, along with our epinephrine, norepinephrine is going to help us free it up. Meanwhile, insulin is telling you to chill out and keep it in there. Now, when we're looking at converting fructose 6-phosphate into fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, which is done by phosphofructose kinase, PFK, if we have high amounts of ADP, AMP, phosphate, and ammonia in the cell, we're going to go faster. If we've got huge amounts of ATP, or notice the hydrogen ions, so that could be from doing too much anaerobic metabolism, we're going to start to shut it down. And so on. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by reading the slide too, but is there anything on here that just doesn't make a lot of sense to you guys you'd like me to go and touch on? Awesome. So when it comes to energy systems, guys, always keep in mind, I like this pyramid concept because it's fun for me, I guess, that our energy systems are going to be where the base of our pyramid is always going to be breaking down fats aerobically. Then it's going to be breaking down carbs aerobically. Then it's going to be carbs anaerobically, and finally ATP PCR. Each athlete's energy system development is going to look like this pyramid. Certain parts of the pyramid are going to be bigger than others. And the good old adage is a pyramid can only be as big as its base. So if we want to have a greater total amount of energy production, we need to build up our lower levels. We need to have a better ability to break down fats aerobically and carbohydrates aerobically, and then we can start focusing on that anaerobic glycolysis and ATP PCR. Now, a lot of athletes are naturally going to be really lopsided. So if we're talking about a cross-country athlete, their triangle's going to be like this. If we're going to talk about like a shot putter or thrower, it's going to be super thin and super high because they don't need as much. But the reason we should always care about these energy systems and appropriately fueling is once the shot putter throws the shot, them walking over to grab the shot and then bring it back, they're utilizing aerobic glycolysis and beta oxidation to recover all those muscles that just trained hards, ATP, PCR, and then what little lactate that they produced, along with that's how they're going to move their body over them. So having a better level of conditioning, specifically the aerobic side of it, is going to be useful for every single athlete you're ever going to encounter because they can literally do more attempts and get in more reps in any given activity than an athlete that doesn't have as great of an aerobic base. And that individual, turns out the one that does the most reps in nearly any single given endeavor is usually the one that gets to be better at the sport and especially faster. Now, if you guys know of any exceptions to that rule, I am ready to hear about how wrong I am. And don't get me wrong, there's always gonna be outliers of people that are just freaky good at things without barely trying. But can you guys think of any sport where you get better at it by doing it less? Like I said, I'd be Fascinated. If anyone's got anything they want to shoot across the bow on that one. Rock and roll. So, yeah. Yeah, we went through the energy systems pretty quick. Okay, so that was fun. However, let's actually have some fun. For you guys can talk to one another and me, and not be all just listening to me talk to the wall by myself, because it's so lonely in here, guys. Okay, so here's what we're gonna go and do. We're gonna have you guys divide up into 4 separate groups, okay? And we're going to have you guys think about what would really be the energy demands. Just break it down by macronutrient, and you can also touch on ATP, PCR for an athlete given their sport, and that how we would maybe try to get at the basics of trying to fuel the athlete during practice, during games, and during training. Now, for example, I'll start off with one that's really simple. I will compete again in powerlifting. God knows when that will be, but I will compete again. Now, the nice thing about powerlifting is it just requires you to pick something up once and put it down. So you don't have to have really much energy systems at all. The key is you're going to spike hard on the ATP CR, but you should do that rep in less than 5 seconds. And aside from the first time I actually deadlifted 700 pounds, I have always gotten the reps done in less than 7 seconds. So from there, all of the recovery is going to be effectively done by aerobic glycolysis and aerobic beta oxidation. Now, higher repetition work is naturally going to use more carbohydrate, meaning anaerobic glycolysis, specifically during hypertrophy phases. But true, like maximal style training with long rest periods and low repetitions, it's going to be pretty much just alternating between ATP PCR and beta oxidation. So for me, I don't really need to worry about supplementing with much of anything, other than obviously in the creatine, it has its uses for strength, power, performance, and then also with the other comments I threw out there earlier. But, and it turns out I'm an American, so I got more than enough fat that I can use as fuel. So for me, we don't really need to worry about using any types of fueling strategies. But for you guys, let's go ahead and pick sports that have a pretty solid metabolic requirement. So in the chat, I want you guys to throw up, we're going to have 4 different options, and it's okay if they repeat. And then we're going to have you guys break into groups, and each of those groups, whatever is the first thing that gets thrown up, that'll be group 1, group 2, group 3, etc. You guys will be randomly put in there, and then, like I said, how much of each energy system do you think you're really going to be using when you're playing that sport, when you're training for that sport, and then when you're just kind of training in general, and then how we're going to try to fuel it. Ooh, wrestling, great choice, Jake. So that's number 1, track and field. Okay, Cam, that's a good idea. The problem is track and field goes anywhere from throwers to the people running the 300 meter. And ask Hannah, the one that does the one is not doing the other. So good. Swimming. Okay, cool. So we'll do cross country. So cool. We'll have wrestling, swimming, and cross country. And for swimming, Ian will go middle distance, just because same thing, swimming has got long distance and short distance events. So let's go ahead and go one more. Goalie in what? Soccer. Okay, sounds good. Okay, so group 1, you guys are going to be looking at wrestling, and we're going, collegiate Greco, or not, yeah, I think it's catch wrestling is what it's called. Then group 2 is going to go ahead and do middle distance swimming. Group 3 is going to do true cross country, and we'll go like collegiate lengths. And then finally, yeah, we'll go with a goalie in soccer, but you guys can branch out a little bit more than that, because I think that's going to be relatively easy for you. And then when they're actually competing in their sport, what are the energy systems they're using? When they're training for their sport, which is going to be different, which ones are they going to be focusing on for the most part? And then finally, when they're just doing their normal like strength conditioning, etc., what's that going to look like? What are we going to maybe have to add? So we're going to go ahead and get you guys randomly put into those groups. I'm going to give you guys 6 minutes to kind of talk it through. What I want you guys to do is inside of there, I want you guys to literally start typing up in chat. So whenever we come back and we all meet together, I want you guys to go ahead and have something that you can just paste into the chat so everybody can read it. And then we're going to go ahead and I'll probably ask you a few questions, as will everybody else. So give me a yes if this makes sense to you guys. Awesome. All right, guys. So have fun. And yeah, I'm looking forward to see what you guys come up with. Go for it. You don't really need to listen to me ever, but especially right now. So let's take the sport of football. When you look at the sport of football, when you're actually playing the sport, it's really not that stressful, metabolically speaking. That you're going to have the game, you're going to have the play, and then you're going to go ahead and have a longer rest period and break, and then you're going to be able to go back, and you kind of have that, work to rest ratio that's usually about anywhere from 3 to 7 seconds, and then usually 35 seconds or more. Now it's practice that is a much higher tempo, in that you typically are going to have far less rest. You're going to be doing a lot more repetitions of a lot of different drills. And so that is actually going to be, for a lot of football players, more stressful than the game. So you're going to probably make sure that you've got adequate amounts of electrolytes, putting a decent amount of carbohydrates in there, but you don't need to worry about going that hard initially. It's going to be more when we're in the 2-a-days. That's where we would probably want to make sure we're really giving them a carbohydrate beverage, because it's hard to replenish that glycogen from just eating one big meal before you got to go back into your second practice. So the sport of football, the training is going to be much harder than the game. And at the same time, periods of training are going to be even more intense.
That's the main problem with a lot of guys on our team, is not a lot of them get they don't put into their body what they need to before practice. Because we'll have a lot of guys just in the short few weeks that I've noticed, they'll get really tired really quick and they run out of energy, and we'll have to drop like Powerade packets with salt electrolytes. Like it's crazy, because most of them they prepare decent but not good enough for what they need to do. Because they'll come in at 6 a.m, they'll do lifting, then they'll go do treatments, and then they'll come in the afternoon, do a 3-hour practice. And most of the time, most of them probably haven't eaten that much throughout that entire period of the day.
And that's a very real problem with a number of athletes, where they're definitely not going to get up before practice enough, or the morning weights, to eat something. Mm-hmm. Depending on their class schedule and otherwise, they might have to go, yep, Hannah's definitely on board. And it's not just the football team, it's every team, especially on the collegiate level, you're going to have these issues with them to a certain extent. And so obviously individuals, and so you're right of having, that's why you can see there's required meal times, required snack time, or at least giving them a carbohydrate beverage whenever they're practicing, is something to kind of buoy up those glycogen levels so they're not going to fall apart. So, Courtney, research, yes, training the anaerobic system, but also having a good aerobic base to recover. The average match lasts under a minute with an average rest period of 10 to 15 seconds. For collegiate wrestling, you can sometimes have to go and do multiple 3-minute rounds. So it lasts a little bit longer than that, but you're right. You're going to be really hard. So we were probably where you're sitting in that VO2 max of like over 100%. So it's going to really just decimate glycogen levels. And then you have another big problem with wrestlers, which is they try to make weight. And so they're going to be depleting themselves quite frequently. And so, yeah, giving them enough calories to go through those practices and then also allow them to recover can be absolutely true. But hopefully the competitions are also less stressful than the games. Okay, and then for you guys with swimming, because it's all over the map between Emily and Hannah working out their emotional problems in this chat, you're going to utilize, obviously, all the energy systems. The usual competitions are going to be a lot more anaerobically glycolytic, because they're usually out there for 1 to 2 minute sprints of maximal effort. And you're going to be doing, obviously, a lot more aerobic style work along with anaerobic work when you're actually training. So same type situation. And they can have long practices. So making sure we're going to it adequately supplied and we're giving ourselves a chance to recover. Ryan Carter with the cross-country athlete. Yep, you're definitely going to use aerobic glycolysis. In training, they're probably going to go through glycogen faster because they're at a higher, in competition. They're going to go through glycogen faster because they're higher intensity. Some days they might be doing more low intensity work. Others days they might be doing more high intensity, like repeat work. So either way, they're going to be friggin' living, body by carbs. Now for goalies, goalies use the ATP, PCR, and anaerobic systems during games. Hopefully, they're only using beta oxidation, which means they didn't really have to do much. If they have to use a lot of anaerobic glycolysis, boy howdy, their defense is doing a bad job. And so, but practice for them, again, that's probably going to be getting more anaerobic. That's also going to be a lot more metabolically taxing. So, yeah, good job, guys. Good job. So, nice. Do you guys have any other questions about any of the stuff that we've covered so far tonight? Nope. Okay. Well, go ahead, Josh.
Oh, I have a question about something else. Like, I haven't picked a topic yet, and honestly, I have no idea what I'm interested in. So I was just like, yo, I'm open to suggestions here.
Well, you're a power lifter, so I'd say you could look at nutritional strategies for power lifters.
Okay, well, okay. I mean, I know you were saying like it needs to be a scholarly article and everything, and I saw that was like due tonight, and I didn't know what I wanted to do, so I was just asking.
No, that's okay. Eric Helms, he's done a decent amount of stuff looking at athletes. You could look at, I don't think Trexler has done a lot on nutrition stuff, but I look at Eric Helms. You could also look at Schoenfeld. And then one thing that I think is really fascinating is looking at the literature out there on how high protein diets are effectively nothing to be worried about as long as you don't have kidney disease. That could be something you could look into. But when in doubt, like it could be a supplement you find interesting. Obviously, we talked a little bit about creatine. Please don't do creatine. I know some of you guys are doing it, and that's fine. It's just literally creatine and caffeine are the most two heavily researched of all nutritional supplements of all time. So the stuff's it's out there. I think we're good. I think we know they work, and in specific contexts, some better than others. But I would say, yeah, for the things that I'm interested in, you guys might not be, and that's okay. But I don't know, is there anything nutritionally that kind of jumps at you that's interesting?
I've done a lot of, just with my thesis, I've found a lot of research on carbohydrate supplementation versus carbohydrate plus protein supplementation in weightlifting, and which produces like the best recovery and performance. I don't know if you'd be interested in that, but there's a lot of research on it.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true, Hannah. There's some good stuff for nutrient timing. So, how quickly do you do it after exercise? And then there's even some stuff comparing. There's going to be different studies. So you can hopefully find a review that's going to look at things like, is it just carbohydrate with a complete protein? Is it carbohydrates plus leucine? Is it carbohydrates plus essential amino acids? And you kind of see what's out there in that area as far as post-workout nutrition. So very good point. Anybody else have any other questions, concerns, comments? Anything for good of the order? Things you guys want to bring up for the class?
I'm assuming what's due tonight, you want us to find an article that's over the topic that we picked for the project, correct?
So the key is you're going to literally send me the link for the article, or at least like the title, author name, because then I'm going to double check and be like, okay, this is in fact a peer-reviewed article. This is a review article. Like, this is what you should do it over. A couple folks had good, somebody sent me something from the Gatorade Institute, which is good stuff, but that's not peer reviewed, so to speak. It's written by a pretty good source. And another one sent me something from the NCAA, which, I don't trust the evil empire. So, that once again, they're not peer reviewed. The information they had in there was good, but it's not being effectively looked at by other scholars to make sure that it is an appropriate and accurate representation of the information. So hence why we're looking for, from a journal, some type of review article of a topic that you're interested in. Because the meta assignment to it is that you read it and think like, okay, this is what a review article should look like. So whenever you write your review at the end of the semester, you'll have this as like, okay, this is what this should look like. So everybody else good to go? Awesome, guys. Well, stay safe out there as always. Yeah, I will see you guys next week, and we will keep on trucking, and also make sure that you're working on those wonderful diet homeworks when it comes to getting certain amounts of macronutrients on a budget. Hint for all of you guys, whole milk and eggs are usually always really cheap and a massive source of calories, but it makes for a very sad, sad diet. So
Oh, that's been my life recently. That's exactly what I was gonna do.
You can get
Oh,
a dozen jumbo eggs from Walmart for 98 cents.
yeah, you can pretty much do the all white diet of just have rice, milk, and eggs, and just have sadness for every meal of the day. But yeah, you'll be able to live real cheap. So stay.
Well, I've been eating a Dave's triple every single day though. That's
What's
the
that?
secret. A Dave's triple, like a triple cheeseburger from Wendy's. That's the secret to getting shredded. Dave's triples.
Josh, please never change, bud. Never change. You guys have a great night, and yeah, we will talk more soon. Bye bye.